So our second keynote speaker is Dr. Bill Fields, and everybody that's been in the radon industry for very long is going to recognize his name. We appreciate him being here. One of the foremost authorities on radon, not only for his research into the radioactive gas, but because of his advocacy and outreach efforts. He's actively been involved in radon-related research for over 25 years. Dr. Field is a professor at the University of Iowa's College of Public Health with appointments in the Department of Occupational Environmental Health and Department of Epidemiology. Welcome, Dr. Field. Your topic is where do we go from here? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's great to be here with you. As I'd like to thank AARST for inviting me to talk this morning. It's certainly an honor. It would be nice to be there in person with each of you, but perhaps another year we can look forward to that. I must say it was a real challenge to present, to try to figure out what I was going to talk about today. I was thinking about all the different possibilities about where we go from here. Topics like finding a specific biomarker unique to radon, the need to push for national radon-resistant new construction. But you know what's funny is after 25, 30 years doing research on radon, what I found myself looking back as much as I was looking forward, I guess we have to learn from what we've done in the past to figure out where we go today. So it was a lot of memories in the past. So I plan to retire officially at the end of 2021 from teaching, but I hope to stay as an emeritus professor and continue doing some research and definitely some advocacy on radon. So it's funny that preparing a talk on where do we go from here, that there was as much looking back as there was looking forward. So these are just some of my ideas from my position as a university professor, someone that's been active in the field, about if I could wave a magic wand and change things or work towards certain things. These are just a few of the topics I would pick. So as you can see in this picture here, there's so many places we've been. Sometimes it's always not a straight path. Sometimes it's we go around circles. Sometimes we hit dead ends. But hopefully, as we move forward, we're not all in a fog. We can see some clarity to what we need to do. And I always thought that a good talk to give maybe before this one is where do we want to go, but where have we been? I think that would be maybe in a future meeting an excellent talk for someone to give with that can provide that perspective. So hopefully I'm not leading us into a fog and I can see with a little bit of clarity, get us on the straight and narrow, as you will, as we move forward. So, and coming up with topics that I wanted to focus on, and like I said, it could have been, I got 20 things listed here, but due to time, I'd like to pick 4 to talk about where we go from here. One is the current radon action level. One is occupational exposure to radon. Another one is health effects research. And then I think I really want to reinforce that we have a need to really in the future talk about comparative risk of radon. So it's storming here and we have a bad thunderstorm. So hopefully that doesn't interfere with any connection. So this is a figure that was published back in 1986 by Nero, and this is one of the first studies. It used 552 individual data points, and you can see this is one of the first papers where we got an idea of what the distribution was of radon in the United States. This is one that's cited quite often to show that there's a log normal distribution. So most of the radon occurs in the concentrations below 2 picocuries per liter. So that was an early paper. Later on, we had the national residential radon surveys that were performed. And with the surveys, we came up, the EPA came up with an arithmetic mean of about 54 picocuries per liter. That was all floors combined. And as you can see, it surprisingly has pretty good agreement with the Nero findings. Let me just move this down here. And then you can see here homes above 370, 148, you know, pretty consistent, even though these are pretty sad data points or pretty sad data set other than the national survey that we dealt with, and a lot of bias within the Cohen and Nero data set, but still came up with similar findings. But I think it was, as we look at this, we really see the need. A lot of these numbers that we use were generated 30 years or so ago, and we certainly need to update this to get new, more updated maps, radon maps for the future, especially ones that are state specific. We can see here the National Residential Radon Survey. And this is a log plot, radon concentrations, and then probability distribution. And you can see this is 4 picocuries per liter here. And you can see based on this probability distribution, when the EPA action level was set, there was only about 7% of homes or so that were above the EPA's action level at that time. They estimated. The EPA estimated 10, but other people thought 7 or so was about the right number. So if we look at this log normal distribution we have, here's our log normal distribution, similar to the first map or the first figure I showed. You can see here's the EPA's action level, 4 picocuries per liter. And if we look at the attributable risk of radon, so that's how many of the lung cancers are caused by radon. People estimate it's 14, 15%. So we had a attributable risk of 14%, and we set the radon action level to 4. That means we're taking care of about 4 or 5 of the attributable risks. So maybe about a third of the risks due to radon exposures we're addressing by the EPA's action level. And we'd have to get down a little bit near 2 to take care of about half of it. So a lot of the exposure is occurring to a large number of the population at lower concentrations, which by chance can initiate the lung cancer. Now, early on, if you look at the back in '86, the Citizen Guide came out, Citizen Guide to Radon, and EPA came up with these figures. Exposure to this range are considered above average. You should undertake action to reduce it. 4 or below, we recommend you take action within a few years. So there were time restraints that were included within the guidance. And then if your concentration is 4 picocuries or lower, exposure in this range considered average or slightly above average, although exposure do present some risk. Reductions of levels this low may be difficult. So I think as we, over the next few slides, you see some of the bases that we have for the EPA's action level is really, say, technologically based with some cost effectiveness built in action level. And it's not it's not a health-based or risk-based guideline. And then here's EPA action level. Here's the technical support document. This is contained with this information here is contained within the technical support document. The results from the EPA's mitigator surveys indicated radon can be reduced to 4 picocuries per liter 95% of the time, and to 2 picocuries per liter about 70% of the time. Reducing action level to 2 would increase the false negative rate 3-fold and the false positive rate 2-fold. So they did a good number of studies, and they had concerns about reducing it below 4. There would be some problems with the dosimetry or the assessing exposure as far as false negatives and false positives. And Congress, though, understood and realized that the 4 picocuries per liter is not a safe level, and they wanted to make sure that was included within any information going out to the public. After more recently, based on the findings from the case control pooled studies that definitely showed a increase in radon, increase in risk at 100 becquerels per cubic meter for the pooled analysis, WHO initiated their international radon program and developed guidance for member countries that deal with radon. One of their recommendations was that there be a reference level of 100 becquerels per cubic meter to minimize health hazards due to radon. And then if that cannot be reached under prevailing country-specific conditions, the chosen reference level should not exceed 300 becquerels per cubic meter. And this is equivalent to about 10 millisievert or a rem per year of exposure based on ICRP recommendations. So they came up with that number. Still, it's important to note, this is still a technologically based guideline and not really a health-based guideline per se, or rather a risk-based guideline. I mean, it considers risk, but it also includes feasibility of reducing below 2.7, as well as detector uncertainties and cost-benefit analysis. So if you look at the global action on radon, EPA, currently we have 148, European Union, Countries belonging to the European Union must follow the European directive of 300 becquerels or less, and that's for both dwellings and workplaces. And Canada has a 200 becquerel per cubic meter guideline. There are some countries, such as Denmark, Netherlands, and Norway, that have a reference level at 100 becquerels per cubic meter. So these countries early on back in the 80s were also somewhat ahead of many other countries in developing guidelines for radon as far as mitigation and as well as mitigation techniques. So this is interesting to look back. This was findings from the President's Cancer Panel back in 2008. Jay Lubin, I, and Susan Conrad was asked to present about radon. And the President's Cancer Panel, they reviewed new information about radon or about other environmental exposures. That was the focus that year. And radon came out as one of the highest rated environmental exposures that the President's Cancer Panel examined. And this was just some information that Susan presented. Some of the key points of her presentation was Indoor Radon Abatement Act. EPA does have authority to regulate indoor radon. However, the agency has chosen to rely on voluntary programs for controlling radon exposure. It has an active radon outreach effort to promote voluntary risk reduction and extensive partnership of stakeholders. But I think what's important are recommendations from the President's Cancer Panel well over 10 years ago now. One of their recommendations was the EPA should consider lowering its action level of 4 picocuries per liter for radon exposure, taking into account data on radon-related lung cancer risk developed since the existing action level was established. And I kind of felt bad for Susan at the meetings because she was the lone EPA representative. And after we gave our presentations, Margaret Kripke, Dr. Kripke, asked Susan, she goes, my goodness, just all this risk is one of the most highest risk environmental carcinogens out there. Who dropped the ball on this? Why isn't more being done? And I felt bad for Susan because it was like she had the ability to set guidelines and be the person. But I think this was one of the first places where you could talk about where there was a recommendation from a independent group that the action level maybe should be reduced. They also mentioned that healthcare provider education has been developed, and we've certainly been working on that over the past few years. One recent update is the AARST Consortium Executive Stakeholder Committee has convened a scientific advisory committee that's going to explore the pros and cons of advocating for a federal policy to use WHO guidance of 2.7 picocuries per liter. And I applaud the leadership of this group for the people they can convene, excellent group of people. You can see, you probably recognize many of these individuals from their research contributions over the years and their policy contributions, including John Salmon, who led the Beer 6 committee. So the next thing I want to talk about is occupational radon exposure. So as I don't have to sort of speaking to the choir, as you know, there's lots of potential for exposure to radon in occupational settings. And this was a list that I put together a good number of years ago. And since then, we've included within the ATSDR toxicological profiles. But there's, you can see, some of these are well known. Obviously, mill tailings working with uranium, natural caves, fertilizer, phosphate, oil refining workers, hard rock miners, tunnel workers working underground, radon health mines, water plant operators. But one occupational exposures that really needs more emphasis in the future, it's really the incidental exposure in any occupation from local geologic radon sources. The vast majority of people getting exposed are being exposed in say, retail stores, many buildings that in many cases look a lot and function from a air movement perspective, like homes do. But there's just a vast majority of people out there getting exposed in their workplaces. And there's been very few studies to date really looking at the extent of that. This was a study that one of my doctoral students performed a few years ago, published in 2015. And what she looked at was the radon concentrations in the home of an individual, and then what their radon concentration was in the workplace where they worked. And you can see as many observations that we had. So the person, the majority of these people worked in county extension agencies in Missouri, and then they did a radon test in their home. They did a radon test in their workplace, and then an outside radon concentration. And as you can see here, the concentration, and these are all first floor measurements. These are not lowest livable or basement measurements. You can see the range, vary greatly, but there's pretty similar findings between the home and the workplace. This is just one small snapshot of the kind of exposures that I think we're seeing out there. There's been some other papers that parallel this information. So unless it's a huge office building or a building with some sort of unique airflow or makeup air or ventilation, you're going to find a lot of homes and workplaces have very comparable radon concentrations, and just haven't heard much about workplace radon concentration. I think this is an area we definitely need to move in the future. One of the interesting things about the OSHA exposure limit, OSHA exposure limit for an adult employee, I keep moving these little pictures all around here, I apologize for that. The OSHA radon exposure limit for adult employees is 100 picocuries per liter average over a 40-hour work week, and requires them to perform surveys and such. But this hasn't been changed in 30, 40 years, this exposure limit. And there's some good references. I have linked here to the page. If you need any references for the occupational exposure limit, let me know. If you look at other US worker regulations, OSHA has their 12 working level month annual limit, DOE's 10, NRC's 4, and Mine Safety Health Administration is 4 picocuries per liter. But if you look how the OSHA 12 working level limit, it's over 3.5 times higher than any country with a regulation for occupational exposure. And it's over 12 times higher than for the occupational exposure limits for European countries. So I think this definitely needs to revisit and updated. One of the interesting things is in 1987, NIOSH recommended lowering the permissible exposure limit from 4 working level months to 1 working level month. And Dr. Assistant Surgeon General Donald Miller noted that although NIOSH was recommending lowering the PEL to 1 for radon, he did not believe the recommendation satisfied NIOSH's commitment. So this is lowering it to 1. He questioned, and let me just read his letter here. Although I approve of the recommended exposure limit of 1 working level per year, I do not feel this part of the recommended statement fully satisfies the Institute commitment to protect the health of all the nation's miners. Future research may provide evidence of a new, more effective methods for reducing occupational exposures to radon progeny, more reliable risk estimates of low exposure levels, and improved risk assessment methods. If new information demonstrates that a lower exposure limit constitutes both prudent public health and feasible engineering policy, NIOSH will revise its recommended standard. So we know now from the pooled miner studies that we do see risk at this lower level, at the 1 working level month. So if you compare him having concerns about the 1 working level month limit that they were advocating, that he was advocating, or asking agencies to adopt, I mean, this is 12 times higher than what the Assistant Surgeon General was even considering or questioning whether or not it was safe. So these definitely need updated. And there's some nice references here on these different limits. Bob Lewis has a nice one that he published at an AARST meeting many years ago. So let me move on to health effects research. So there's suggestive evidence for a lot of different diseases, other than lung cancer, where we have a firm foundation that radon is dose response, has a good dose response relationship, even down below 3 picocuries per liter with no known threshold. But there's suggestive evidence for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, leukemia, cerebral vascular disease, and numerous other health outcomes. The problem with a lot of studies that have been performed are ecologic in nature, meaning that their exposure assessment was done using aggregate data or surrogate data. So a lot of studies don't have individual level radon estimates for individuals in these studies, which makes you question the validity of the study. So they're good for generating hypotheses. They're not so good for assessing risk. Here's just give you a few of the papers. This is a paper published by Michelle Turner and Dan Krusky. Dan was the leader for the North American polling, and they found an association between COPD mortality in the American cohort society study. And you can see there were a large prospective cohort study of 1.2 million Americans that were recruited. But what they used for exposure was the mean county residential radon concentration. So additional studies on COPD need to be performed. A colleague of mine here at the University of Iowa was trying to incorporate radon assessment within the COPD gene study, where they do whole genome sequencing. So you really need that one-to-one match. You need the radon concentrations and the following the COPD progression or initiation. Here's another study looking at residential radon exposure and certain types of leukemias. And this was the American Cancer Society study as well, with estimates again. So they found an association with lymphoid leukemias, but again, we have surrogate data, although we have a huge sample size. We also did a study here in Iowa. It's called the Iowa Radon Leukemia Study, and we did this to generate hypotheses, and that we could then follow up with a case control study. We haven't been able to get funding to do the case control study in Iowa, but we did find an increase in chronic lymphocytic leukemia. There's some recent, you may have seen a South Korean paper out that found an association between radon exposure and stroke. And in this study, they did actually measure the radon in the homes of the participants, and it was a fairly large cohort. And as you can see, as radon, this is increasing radon, and this is the odds ratio or increased risk. So like here is, one is no increased risk, and then as we go up higher, you can see a 50% increased risk. And some of these look fairly linear increase. So this study we thought were interesting. About 2 months ago, I submitted a R01 grant application to NIH to look at a large cohort in Southeast United States with individual measurements in that study to see if we see similar findings as they found in South Korea in regard to stroke. So one of the things I want to talk about, this is a bit diversion, and it's kind of new, it's kind of controversial in regard to health effects, but we all know that we have radon. It's not the radon gas that causes the lung cancer in most cases, the polonium-218 and the polonium-214 that decay by alpha decay and initiate the lung cancer. But what we don't know, and like I said, this is just conjecture on my part, just looking at what data is out there yet. But if I was working in this field and doing health-related research, this is certainly an area that I would focus on in the future if I was just starting my career. So we know these decay, and when these decay, if they're unattached, their size fraction is really in the ultrafine particle size. So we're talking, extremely small, but maybe even a little bit less than a nanometer in size for these individual decay products. If they clump together, you may get some that are 1 to 3 nanometers. So you can see this is what you generally consider particulate matter air problem 2.5, and then we have the coarse. But you can see how many of these you can find in the air. One of the unique things about these small ultrafine particles is they can't enter the systemic circulation. So this is a slightly complex picture, but bear with me if you will. So you inhale the nanoparticle. If it's above 30 nanometers in size, it can generally pass into systemic circulation through macrophages will engulf it and put it through the lymphatics and clear it that way in many cases. If it's below 30 nanometers, what can happen is you can have what they call translocation of a nanoparticle directly into the bloodstream. And when this gets into the bloodstream, then it can be circulated to different parts of your body, your spleen, your kidney, and bone marrow. So we look at exposure with radon a good bit by thinking about our traditional way to look at it, polonium-218 and 214. I think we have to look at translocation of particles into the body, radon decay products. Now, people are looking at this from particulate matter and air. They haven't looked at it at all, as far as I know, at the individual level, looking at the decay products that can be translated to smaller ones. And this is a recent picture of what happens when you inhale. You get these ultrafine particles. Some are deposited in the respiratory tract and cause lung inflammation and cause systemic inflammation. Some, there's a question whether or not they can be transported through the nervous system. Some interesting studies being done there. And then you have translocation to the interstitium, and then some of these can become bloodborne and then transported to extrapulmonary organs. So all these different pathways can lead to cardiac issues, vascular dysfunction, increased blood clotting. One of the things we know, these seem to be happening, these mechanisms seem to be happening for particulate matter. And there's no reason to think that the decay products may also not cause reactive oxygen species or inflammation once they're imported. There was just a recent study out that showed that these nanoparticles tend to accumulate at areas of plaques. So if you have a plaque in your system, that could have free radical production around that plaque or inflammation, there'd be a higher chance of stroke occurring. So this is an area that I haven't really done any work in, but there's people out there, you can see people that publish papers like this that are really trying to urge them to move toward looking at radon decay products as well. And then I really urge you to look at some of the work coming out of Harvard. The Harvard folks have been really active looking at what they call radioactive particles. And these are ambient particles. These are the particles outside. Many of them are radon decay products that release beta decay or the polonium-210. But they've been publishing a good number of papers. I just put a few here. Now they're having a series of webinars. They had the first one last week, and there's 3 more coming up. And the last one is on radon. So what their hypothesis is that these radon decay products are in the outdoor air. And you breathe these radon decay products in, and there's some sort of interaction with particulate matter, or maybe just by themselves, that they're causing these non-cancer adverse health effects. So here's some of the papers. You can see this is in Journal of American Heart Association. So I don't know if it's because I don't understand it yet, really how they're doing these studies from a validity standpoint, or if it's valid, and I just don't understand the biological mechanism. But one of the concerns is that they're using, again, ecologic data from the RadNet network. But here's just some of the papers, and I think it could be really interesting. But I think these studies need more scrutiny, and they need repeated by other people. Again, it's always better to use individual level data if you can, but a lot of the particulate studies use estimates of exposure from different types of fixed monitors. So here's one: association between ambient particles and blood pressure. Effect modification, ambient particle mortality by radon. Association between ambient particle radioactivity and lung function. And Koutrakis is the primary investigator, and I think it's leading a lot of this work, Petros Koutrakis. And he's at Harvard, and their group's at Harvard. Association B, ambient particle radioactivity and lung function. So I think it's an interesting line of research. I think it definitely deserves further examination to assess the validity of their studies and to see how that findings, if they're finding these kind of effects outdoors, what it can mean for non-cancer outcomes indoors. So here's another one, ventricular arrhythmia with exposure to air pollution, particle radioactivity. And what they use for their data is really the RadNet monitoring network that's throughout the United States. Measures, they have filters that they collect and then get some information on polonium concentrations that are measured, and then backtrack to the previous radon decay products. So I urge you to definitely watch their last seminar. They have 2-hour seminars, so I'll try to see if we can get that out to everyone. I also link these on the Radon Professionals LinkedIn group webpage too, so you can go there to try to find the link. But definitely interesting research that's being done, and perhaps this is where we go from here. This type of research, we'll have to see. So I have some concluding thoughts. You know, working in this field for so many years, I can remember first hearing about waters, first hearing about the radon issue when I was working as a health physicist at University of California, Berkeley, and thinking, you know, what's all this radon about? Little did I know that this many years later, you know, we'd be at this point, have the assessments that we do have done. But one of the things that really strikes me is that if you look back into the 80s and 90s, this was a ranking, a public ranking, and then a scientific ranking. And this is generated through the EPA via the National Safety Council and other organizations to get information out. You can see radon was tied in the scientific ranking as ranking environmental hazards. One of the things I've been getting feedback from people through the poll, where do other people think that we should go from here? And here's some of the ideas: updated risk assessment based on current data for population, housing, pre and post mitigation, and lung cancer risk. Obtain full access to radon test data and update national and state maps. Obtain full access to radon test data and update national and state maps. Strengthen and support state programs to gather data and implement protective policy. And you can see some of the states do not require professionals to adhere to certain standards. And it would also be nice if we could get money that mitigators pay for installing mitigations back into the radon program for that state rather than going to some central fund. Enact radon testing, all federally assisted insured housing, and then fund scalable research activities. So this is some of the input that I received. But I think what we really need to do, is my last section, is we really need to reinforce comparative risk as we go forward. If you look at all the carcinogens that EPA regulates, radon is by far has the greatest number of deaths. If you look at cancer mortality, and you've seen this picture many times, or this figure or table many times for me, radon-induced lung cancer, if it was its own disease category, would be one of the top 10 causes of cancer mortality in the United States. So we have to stress this. So much, we always see radon, or not radon, but lung cancer induced by smoking highlighted, and then radon looks like it pales in comparison to that risk. It's right, smoking, as colleagues in Kentucky and other states know, it's huge. I mean, there's so many deaths caused not just by lung cancer, but other adverse health outcomes that you can't really compare radon to that. But if you compare it to other environmental carcinogens, I can't believe that this has been ignored by federal agencies for so many years, unlike how it was back in the 80s. If you look at the unfinished business from 1987, when the unfinished business was ranked, you see worker exposure to chemicals and radon was tied when they looked at a comparative risk, when EPA looked at its comparative risk assessment. And look at the number of from these primary exposures back then, we see about 240 cases were estimated annually, but there were 20,000 other substances that may contribute to cancer. And then you have radon here that we know causes about 20,000 lung cancer deaths. So back then it was rated very high by the agency. Back then the EPA did comparative risk assessments and based some of their priority of what they have to address on comparative risk assessment. Here's a paper that was included as a sample paper within the EPA reporting on radon. And as you can see here, figure means that radon causes more mortalities than any other environmental pollutant under the agency's jurisdiction. This was listed within the reporting on radon as a good sample story to get out to people. It was originally published in the Wall Street Journal. Just want to In April 1987, the Senate hearing, Deputy EPA Administrator James Barnes was asked by Senator Mitchell, "Are you confident that the action level of 4 picocuries per liter is adequate to protect the public health?" And he answered, "The risk that you and I run from radon in the outdoor air of about 1 in 1,000 is also higher than we would have under many of the regulatory programs we have in place." So it back in those days, I know radon was just the spread, the distribution of radon, elevated radon in the country was really just discovered back around this time with Watrous and other findings. But there was a different paradigm at the EPA that rated radon as this is a pressing issue that we need to really address. We haven't seen that to any extent since back in the 80s and 90s. And a couple of last quotes. May 1990, Senate hearings, Vernon Houck from the CDC testified, "The evidence of radon is strongest of any environmental contaminant. There is no debate on this issue. Anyone that tells you differently is ill-informed, deceitful, or both." And Ray Guyman, director of the Radon Division, EPA's office, reaffirmed the testimony. In the House hearing, Deputy Administrator testified the agency considered radon as the top environmental health problem facing the agency in the nation. So I have this question. What can we do at CDC and the EPA and other government agencies to sort of ignite that spark, ignite that flame that we had back in the 80s, that they had back in the 80s? Now, I'm not being critical of the people that many of us work with in Washington and the regions. These are some of the most dedicated people I've ever seen working with radon. Their heart's there. They're with us. They understand the risk. I'm talking about the individuals at the agencies that take the list of priorities to the Capitol Hill and say, we need more done about this issue. Those are the people we have to get to. Back then, you had EPA being very active at the highest levels, and you also had state senators, and you had senators and you had House people really advocating. You had Senator Waxman, Lautenberg, a lot of these folks. But what we really need for the future is to find some of these champions to help get that spark that we had back in the 1980s. But again, the folks at EPA now, considering how much they've been cut in regard to radon, it's amazing the amount of work they do and the quality of work and their dedication. And I thank them for that. So there was my ideas for some of the ideas for the future, but I think we have to continuously push the comparative risk assessment of radon as we go forward. So there are some of the other things I wanted to include. We could have a 4 or 5 day series just on where do we go from here, but I hope that some of the information I presented was at least thought-provoking or give us some directions for different issues we need to address.
Thank you, Bill, for that very great information. And we've got several questions, and we've got some time for Q&A. So I'm going to read the first question, and then Nicole is going to read the ones that came off of the Whova app. I can't see those. So Josh asks, I missed it. So how would you get tested to find plaque in our system?
Well, yeah, to get plaque. So these are that's why when you go to your doctor, you check your cholesterol. You can't really get tested that much. Some people will do ultrasounds, maybe look at your carotid in different areas to see how much buildup you get. Maybe for your heart, you can get echocardiogram. But the key is to try to reduce plaque. Have low cholesterol. And other factors that lead to these plaques within your body. But I mean, that's where strokes come from. You have these plaques that develop, and then sometimes they'll rupture at these sites, and then you get a stroke in your brain or elsewhere. So there's not really a test to determine what part of your areas have plaques. We probably all have plaques to a certain degree. The point is that how radon decay products and nanoparticles actually work is they tend to build up at these areas where there's damage to the vessels. And if they build up there, there's chance for inflammation and adverse health effects to occur, like stroke.
Sounds like you answered his question. Thank you.
Hope so.
Jane or Amy, whoever is looking at Huva, you want to ask the questions from there? We've got one more from the Zoom chat I'll get to when you're done there.
Okay, this is Jane. The first question in the Hoover Q&A is from Dwayne. When will we have updated mortality statistics? Everyone is still using info from 2004, and it's hard to convince people this information is accurate when it has not been updated.
Yeah, and that's something I've been advocating for a lot of years. So Dave Powell, and I don't want to speak for the EPA or Dave, but Dave Powell at the EPA has been working on providing an updated estimate. I think it was 3 years ago, or whenever the San Diego AARST meetings was, the last session of the meeting, he presented an update on where he was at with that. And I think if I recall back then, so what we have so many more homes now with radon in them and people are exposed than we did 20, 30 years ago. I mean, if we can just get radon resistant new construction, we can stop that bleeding and maybe stop that and make some progress there. But you have more people exposed, so you would assume that the number is higher than 21,000 right now. But you have people not smoking as much. And without that interaction, we have less people developing radon-related lung cancer because we have less smokers out there. So we don't have that synergism. So I think my guess is if you would look at the number, it probably wouldn't change so much. And that's only because smoking rates have gone down so much. But Dave has been working on that. And, it was really the information used to generate that was really from 1995. So it's a lot of years. So it would be great to at least get a reaffirmation from the agency. I know that this is something that Dave would really like to get out to people, but it would be nice to get some updated information. One of the problems with that estimate is the critical point of estimating how many people is really the interaction between radon and smoking. What is that synergism? Because if you just change that synergism just a little bit, it can affect it by 1,000 to 2,000 people. So that's a really critical aspect of developing those numbers. Plus having updated radon maps, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Great, thanks. And the next question is from Laurie. She says, agree about moving into more awareness on workplace exposure. But even with the OSHA exposure limit, is that actually reported or checked on any of their forms?
On the OSHA forms?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if it's, I know that's the, I guess, legal, that's the legal standard that's out there for workplaces. I don't know if that's checked on their forms. I would highly doubt it. I think I don't want to speak outside what I know, but my understanding is I get calls from OSHA people now and then. It's like, how do I do this test? How do I use it? They use ePerms a lot. A lot of them don't have a whole lot of experience doing radon testing. And I think it's more on a case-by-case basis when they get asked. I know there's been over the years several calls I've gotten from inspectors that were working in caves where people went in, one or two fish hatcheries. So I'm not sure about if it's listed on there. I don't think it's something that they do routinely. I think they only respond to requests.
Okay. The next question is from Maria. Do we have any studies regarding fracking? In counties where fracking is occurring, my radon tests are consistently higher than those that are not. And she's coming from Colorado with this question.
Yes, and if she could contact me, there have been some studies done. In fact, Kutrakis, the researcher at Harvard, just published a paper. I think it was the last couple of months, showing that there's increased beta activity and perhaps radon decay product activity downwind from fracking sites outdoors. I don't know the validity of that study, and I haven't looked into it that much, but I think that's still up in the open about. I know there's papers saying there's an association, but I can't judge it without doing a review of the studies that have been published to date.
Okay. Next question. Do you think an epidemiology risk model study should be initiated for radon mitigators? And this question is from Nathaniel.
I think we've had some before, and I stand corrected on that. We have the models to estimate what the risk is of exposure for mitigators. I can remember many as 25 years ago being involved with some studies looking at risk, but I think it's certainly something that would be worthwhile to consider. But also, I think a good starting point would be to just do a survey of what preventions or what steps are mitigators currently taking to reduce their radon exposure when they're drilling through the slab to put the pit in, or just being in a house with elevated radon concentrations altogether. But this is from a scientist. I'm not really sure about what's already being done out there. That may be better asked to another person.
Okay. Next question from
Jane,
Bradley.
we're at the end of our session here. We really don't have time for any more questions. But we also have four
Chad,
more. We have
Chad,
four.
sorry. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Nicole. We have a couple more minutes. I'd say 5 more minutes or so. So hit the ones maybe in chat. You're good to go. It is 11:45, right?
It's 11:45. Yeah. My sheet says dead stop at 11:45, so that's why I was stopping us.
You're good. You're good.
Okay, we'll keep going for a few more minutes then.
Okay.
All right. The next question, you didn't mention stomach cancer being caused by radon. Is it possible?
Yes, it's biologically plausible. Yes, and I think when the EPA came out with the National Academy of Science review of radon in water, it's certainly they had estimated the number of stomach cancers. I thought it was somewhat surprisingly low what their risk estimate was, but it's certainly biologically plausible. One of the good things about the stomach is the lining of your stomach. It tends to change a lot more than the respiratory epithelium does. So when you get a alpha particle exposure in your lungs and you have a genetic defect, that can then often go on and develop into lung cancer. Your stomach turns the cells in the lining turn over a lot more, which helps minimize the number of stomach cancers. But there's certainly estimated to be, at least several hundred, or a range of 100 or so stomach cancers due to ingestion. There's been some studies out there, epi studies, that have shown that potentially there's more than that, but they need to repeat it to assess further.
Ryan asks, how can we consider lowering the federal action level from 2.7 or to 2.7 when 30 states still have no requirements for radon professionals? I think that's opening a whole can of worms, but that we could talk about for the rest of the day. But if you have a real short answer for that.
Yeah, well, I think we're already seeing some agencies like AARST and others not even using the EPA's action level, and Jane can correct me if I'm wrong, but they're using the WHO guideline right now. So I think just for even just from a perspective of having harmonization, I think it makes sense to reduce it from that perspective.
Okay. Did you have another one, Jane?
It seems to move from my screen. I'm sorry. It was a question from Kevin about.
I've got one.
I don't know what happened here. Go ahead.
Okay. Is this data to be used for the children exposure in home and schools? Also, microfracturing in rocks will increase the mitigation of radon up to the near surface. This is from Dariush. So did I ask that question where it made sense?
No.
Okay, let me reread it. Is this data to be used for the children exposed in homes and schools?
Okay, so I'm not sure what data is referring to. And if I don't answer a question online here, follow up through the Symposium communication portals, or just email me directly with children. There are no epi studies that go back the whole way back to when they were young to assess exposure. It's assumed that children are more radiosensitive, and then exposures that occurred when the children were young could be manifest later as lung cancer. But we haven't been able to directly examine the different time windows for exposure from an epidemiology perspective, but children are considered to be more radiosensitive.
So one more question from Q&A from Kevin. Curious about how much the correlations with indoor radon are also correlations with indoor air pollutants such as combustion emissions and secondhand smoke. Cigarette smoke known to be a cause of stroke.
Yeah, and I would definitely, I can talk to him and provide some of that information. I know some people use sulfur and other indicators of how much inflow from the outdoor air is coming into homes. But yeah, there are a lot of these studies, and a study that we put a proposal in to do, you definitely have to have smoking information on stroke and all the other potential confounders when you do such a study. And that's why it's important when you do these studies to have information on the radon to individual level, the outcome, and then all the confounders that can go into causal factors that you can adjust for in any analysis. But certainly smoking is related. And isn't it interesting, a lot of our exposure from smoking comes from polonium-210, which is also a radon decay product. So radon may be getting you directly from the air you breathe or from the cigarette. So in the end, many of the smoking related cancers are due to the polonium exposure.
Okay, so we are definitely at a hard stop now.
Yes, we are. Sorry.
And so we've got 2 or 3 questions in the Zoom chat that I'm going to see if we can move over to the session chat. That way it will stay available and you can answer that later.
Wonderful, thank you.
Dr. Fields, thank you very much for coming on and doing this for us.
Okay, be safe, everyone.